The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chaya Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Well, hello there, and welcome to a brand new episode of Things Are About to Get Weird. If you're joining me on Spotify today, or indeed YouTube, then I may very well be speaking to you via the medium of video. After years of the podcast being audio only, I thought it was the right time to introduce a proper video element to the show. It's been my number one request from day one, so if you've been excited for video, then consider this a little gift from me to you. But if you're not keen, don't worry at all. Nothing about the audio side of the show is changing, and you can still choose to listen via audio only on Spotify and, of course, all of the other podcast players. Either way, I'm just over the moon that you're here. Even though my voice does sound a bit dodgy today, I was unwell for pretty much all of December and my voice is still not quite right, but I hope it's not too distracting. Anyway, with all of that said, let's get into today's episode topic. Back in the summer, I was sat with my neighbour Becky in her garden and we were talking about the kinds of topics I cover here on the podcast. We got onto the subject of history and our mutual interest in late medieval and Tudor history in particular. And Becky asked me whether I'd heard about the relatively new theory surrounding Edward V. Better known as one of the infamous princes in the Tower. I confirmed that I hadn't, and when she gave me a brief rundown of it, it's safe to say that I was hooked. And the more I read, the more rabbit holes I ended up discovering. So without further ado, allow me to explain. Now, if you don't know much at all about this area of history, and the term late Middle Ages is making you think back to stuffy school classrooms and dull textbooks, let me assure you that this story is anything but boring. In fact, the Princes in the Tower case is so dramatic that it's often named as one of the most fascinating historical mysteries of all time. But today we go a step further, because this story in particular is a kind of mystery within a mystery, which has been brought to the public's attention in the past few years, largely thanks to the hard work of the historians involved in the Missing Princes project, led by Philippa Langley. So right from the start, I wanted to give them major credit, as the theory, or more accurately, two of the theories plural that we're going to be discussing today, wouldn't have even surfaced without their efforts. But before we dive into these modern updates, we have to go back and explore the original Princes in the Tower story. And if this isn't something you've heard about before, then prepare yourselves, because this is one of the strangest and most tragic, yet utterly compelling tales in the history of the English monarchy. Do bear in mind though that I'm not a historian myself, I'm just an enthusiast. But I'll do my very best to bring you the historical context you need throughout this story. Additionally, a quick warning that this discussion will involve brief mentions of the possible deaths of two children. I always want to let you know about these things up front, as I know some people prefer to avoid these kinds of topics. So, who were the Princes in the Tower? Edward and Richard were the two eldest sons of King Edward IV of England, who actually reigned twice. Firstly between 1461 and 1470, and then again from 1471 until his death in 1483. Now you're probably thinking, well, that's a bit weird, and put simply, this was a very weird time in English history, because Edward IV's reigns were set against the backdrop of the Wars of the Roses. Now, if you're a history nerd like me, you'll know how fascinating the Wars of the Roses were, but they were also incredibly complicated and steeped even further back in history, with origins relating back to events like the 100 Years' War, which took place from around the mid-1300s to the mid-1400s. I spent a good few months studying the Wars of the Roses in college, and to be honest, you could easily spend a lifetime studying them. But for our purposes today, I'm going to try and keep things as straightforward as possible. So if you really boil it down, the Wars of the Roses were a series of civil wars fought between two parties, the House of York, the Yorkists, and the House of Lancaster, or the Lancastrians, and they were essentially fighting for their claim over the English throne. The Yorkist emblem was a white rose, and the Lancastrian symbol was a red rose, hence the Wars of the Roses. And these civil wars were fought between the years 1455 and 1487. Now, King Edward IV was a Yorkist who had inherited the throne as the result of several battles. And although his first reign was utter chaos and resulted in him fleeing the country, losing his throne, and then regaining it the next year, his second reign is widely considered to have been much more stable, relatively speaking. But after he died suddenly in 1483, leaving his 12-year-old son, also named Edward, to rule as the new king, it's perhaps not entirely surprising that this peaceful streak in the country's history was about to come to an abrupt end. However, few could have imagined just how dark of a turn things were about to take. Now, when someone so young would inherit the throne, it was usual that someone close to them would be named as their protector. And in this instance, that person was the late king's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Sorry, there are multiple Edwards and Richards in this story, but that's kind of par for the course when it comes to the English monarchy. So we have the 12-year-old Edward, who is now King Edward V, his younger brother, Prince Richard, and also their uncle Richard, the Duke of Gloucester. So although their uncle Richard was also a Yorkist, the boy's mother and the former Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, did not approve of him being named protector. She wanted him removed and for a regency council to be put in place instead, but Richard was having none of it. He essentially engineered a situation whereby he was able to intercept the young king as he travelled from Shropshire towards the capital, and depending on which side you believe, either persuaded or demanded that Edward should take up residence in the Tower of London. By June of 1483, 9-year-old Prince Richard had joined his older brother in the Tower, and the story was that they were to be housed there whilst preparations for the new monarch's formal coronation were underway, as whilst he had been proclaimed king, he hadn't yet been crowned. But before this ceremony could ever take place, a major spanner was thrown into the works. Parliament were fed information claiming that the two boys were, quote-unquote, illegitimate, as their father had been under contract to marry someone else before tying the knot with their mother, Elizabeth Woodville. And who was primed and ready to step forward and take Edward's place as the new king? Of course, it was their uncle, who, in July of 1483, became King Richard III of England. But whilst we know quite a lot about what became of Richard III after this point, namely that he reigned for just a couple of years before being killed at Bosworth Field, which then marked the beginning of the Tudor dynasty as Henry VII took the throne, the same can't be said when it comes to his two young nephews, because after Richard III became king, the princes in the Tower were never seen nor heard from again. Or were they? Here is where this already unusual tale takes a truly bizarre turn. Now, for many centuries, the overwhelmingly favoured theory was that, tragically, the princes' lives were ended in the Tower, probably on the orders of their uncle Richard. And although there is actually little real, concrete historical evidence of this, it's completely understandable, right? Ultimately, Richard III would have had the most to gain from his two nephews' sad demise. This theory has been perpetuated by countless key figures over the centuries, including the hugely influential Tudor statesman and author Sir Thomas More, who quite literally wrote the book on Richard III. In his writings, Thomas More depicted Richard as a murderer and a tyrant, and this is the picture history ran with, to the point that even in Shakespeare's play Richard III, the monarch is shown as a true villain who had his young nephews assassinated. But what if none of this was true? What if the princes hadn't perished in the tower at all, but instead lived out their days away from everyone and everything they had previously known? That's the basis of a fascinating theory put forward back in 2021, at least when it comes to young Edward, and of another that surfaced even more recently. So let's break down these different dramatic and somewhat bizarre possibilities. Now, when I mentioned that there was almost no solid evidence that Richard III did order the princes' deaths, that doesn't mean that there were no signs at all pointing towards this theory. For example, in Sir Thomas More's writings, he accused Richard's right-hand man, Sir James Tyrrell, of killing the princes, along with 2 other men, by smothering them with pillows. More then wrote that their bodies were buried at a, quote, stair-foot in the Tower of London. There are 2 interesting points that appear to back up these claims. Firstly, that Sir James Tyrrell was reported to have confessed to the murders after being sentenced to death for treason in 1502. Although there's little proof of this confession taking place, and if it did, it's widely thought it would have been extracted from him whilst he was being tortured, so it's often taken with a hefty pinch of salt. Additionally, in 1674, there were indeed 2 skeletons found buried beneath a stone staircase at the tower. But again, given the grisly history of the place, it's never been proven who the bones belong to. Was it the princes or any number of other unfortunate souls who had perished at the tower? We simply don't know. Now, don't get me wrong, this theory is definitely interesting and could very well be true, but let's explore the fascinating alternatives that have come to light in more modern times. Now, do you remember back in 2012, there was that incredible news story about the discovery of human remains under a car park in Leicester, which were later proven to be those of Richard III? It was an amazing time to be a medieval history geek, let me tell you. That project was led by the historian I mentioned at the very start of this episode, Philippa Langley, who has since founded the Missing Princes Project. And in 2021, her team, led by researcher John Dyke, put forward the theory that the eldest prince, Edward V, was not in fact killed at all, but was allowed to leave the tower and live under a false identity on land belonging to his half-brother down in rural Devon. And whilst at first this idea sounds too relatively wholesome to be true, the evidence they uncovered which led them to it is quite compelling. As reported in the Telegraph newspaper, the research team followed a trail of documents from the 1400s, and it led them to a small church in the Devon village of Coleridge. And what they discovered there appeared to confirm the information that had led them to the church in the first place. Ready? So, records show that on the 1st of March 1484, the prince's mother left her safe haven at Westminster after reaching an agreement or deal with Richard III. Part of this deal was that her eldest son, Thomas Grey, the Marquis of Dorset, had been pardoned and was allowed to return home from France after fleeing there as a rebel. Elizabeth contacted her son to inform him of this, but in her writing, she made no mention of the plight of his 2 younger half-brothers, the princes, which seemed odd. Documents reveal that 2 days after this, Richard III sent one of his most trusted allies, Robert Markenfield, on a mission to Coleridge in Devon, where Thomas Grey's lands were located, but the nature of this mission was kept a complete secret. Not long afterwards, a young man by the name of John Evans arrived in Coleridge, and despite there being no records whatsoever about his life prior to this time, he was given quite the welcome in the village. He was handed 2 titles, Lord of the Manor and Parker of a deer park located behind the church. That is all suspicious enough, but it's no nowhere near the end of the story, because in 1511, John Evans actually built a new area within St. Matthew's Church, and the researchers believe that this is where he left several major clues as to his real identity as one of the princes in the tower. Ooh, this is so juicy. First things first, in this new section of the church built by John Evans, there's a stained glass window which shows a depiction of Edward V. It's one of only 3 known stained glass portraits of the young king that have ever existed. And whilst you could definitely argue that it's because the land was owned by Edward's half-brother, experts note that this still feels very out of place for the time. It's the kind of thing you'd expect to see in a large, major cathedral rather than a small village chapel. Upon closer inspection, the glass portrait has some interesting details too. For example, within the crown that floats above the prince's head in the window, there are emblems of 41 small deer. And when John Evans installed the work, it would have been the same year that the prince would have turned 41 years old. Strange for sure, but again, you could reasonably attribute this to the link between the landowner and the young king. The next few details, however, are just plain weird. There's a stone effigy of John Evans in the church, and it depicts him as having a pronounced scar on his chin. Then, in another glass window in the church, there's another portrait of a man wearing an ermine jacket, which was only ever worn by royalty, and holding a crown in his hands as opposed to wearing it. At first glance, you think that this is clearly meant to be Edward V. But if you look closer, you'll see that the portrait shows the prince with the exact same, very distinguishable scar on his chin, as well as the same unusual and distinct mouth shape as the stone effigy of John Evans. The more I looked at the photos of both, the more uncanny the likeness looked to me, and the apparent evidence doesn't stop there. On John Evans's tomb, his name appears to be misspelt, with the stone carving of his surname reading EVAS without the N. The researchers have theorized that this could be a clue in itself, because honestly, what are the chances of this being carved incorrectly? It's suggested that the first part of Evas, the EV, stands for Edward V, with the V meaning 5, with the second part, the AS, being a nod to the Latin word for sanctuary, which is Asa. Plus, elsewhere on his tomb, there are some rougher carvings which are no less fascinating. One of them shows the word king with the letters inverted, along with 9 carved lines, which are thought to represent the year 1509. This is when Henry VII died, and if he'd somehow survived the tower, it would have presented a new opportunity for Edward V to try and reclaim the throne. There are multiple other nods to the prince's house, the House of York, worked into the design of the church too, and what struck the researchers is just how much work would have gone into all of these fine details, which would have been so unusual for a small rural village chapel. The lead researcher, John Dyke, told the Telegraph, quote, "To have all these symbolic details in such a remote and inaccessible church, which in 1500 would have only been accessed by cart track, suggests the presence of a person of importance," which is pretty hard to argue with. And if, like me, your thoughts after hearing all of this were, well, why don't they exhume John Evans's remains from his tomb and conduct a DNA analysis? Well, here's where the plot thickens once more, because Evans's tomb is actually empty. Although it's possible that he was instead buried under the church floor, which was also common practice, it does seem odd that he wouldn't just be in his tomb. If it was going to be built, why not bury him in it? And if, in fact, he wasn't laid to rest in the church at all, where are his remains? Perhaps they were reunited with those of certain long-lost family members as part of, say, an existing agreement or deal. Of course, this is pure speculation, just like the rest of the points raised in this theory, but you have to admit that it is weird, right? I've covered enough stories involving coincidences here on the podcast to know that sometimes it's worth looking a little deeper into these strange little potential connections. Now, it's important to say that not everyone was won over by this theory, and I'm going to touch more on that point in a moment, all in the name of balance. But first, I wanted to tell you about one of the other lines of inquiry that Philippa Langley and the Missing Princes Project have been even more vocal about in recent years. And if you did learn about Tudor history at school, then some of the names you're about to hear might just feel familiar. As part of my history A-level, we spent around a year studying Henry VII, and we soon became familiar with a small group of people known as the Pretenders, with two of the most famous being Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck. I'm not going to get into the entire backstory of the Pretenders because this area of history could easily be an entire episode in itself, but for our purposes today, if you boil it right down, when Henry VII won the crown from Richard III, the Yorkists were understandably unhappy, to say the very least. And when various people emerged claiming to be someone who had a legitimate claim to the throne and could therefore challenge Henry, they were often backed by Yorkist supporters. Now, what had been widely accepted historically was that Lambert Simnel had falsely claimed to be another nephew of Richard III's, Edward Plantagenet, the Earl of Warwick, and that Perkin Warbeck had falsely claimed to be the younger of the princes in the Tower, Richard. But in the end, both confessed that they weren't royal descendants whatsoever, but rather regular young men who had got caught up in some wild Yorkist conspiracies to try and dethrone Henry VII. However, last year, Philippa Langley revealed that she and her team had uncovered documents which they believe show that these two pretenders could have actually been the princes in the Tower. In an interview with The Independent, she said, quote, "Henry attempted to cast the Yorkist princes as imposters by giving them false names and reverse engineering their stories. Edward V became a 10-year-old boy called Lambert Simnel, the son of a joiner, tailor, barber, baker, organ maker, or shoemaker. And Richard, Duke of York, became Perkin Warbeck, the son of a French boatman." Talk about an Uno reverse card. If this is true, how wild is it to think that these two historical mysteries involving these two sets of boys could potentially have the same answer? The documents involve all kinds of letters with references to Simnel being, quote, Edward IV's son, and in the case of Warbeck, there was even a document allegedly from the Pope. Langley claims that Lambert and Simnel's confessions that they were indeed pretenders were false and coerced by Henry VII, and that they really were the missing princes, back to try and win the throne that was rightfully theirs. Now, whilst all of this sounds incredible, I have reached the point where I do have to balance things out a little and address one of the main criticisms of the Missing Princes project in general. If you were to look up either of these theories for yourself, be it the John Evans idea or the Pretenders angle, you'd soon find that some of those history enthusiasts discussing the theories are quite critical. Firstly, the opinion that Philippa Langley is somewhat biased in favour of Richard III is quite prevalent. After all, she did dedicate a huge amount of time to the successful search for his remains, and I do get the feeling that overall she is convinced that Richard was was not responsible for his nephew's murders. In that independent article I mentioned, it's noted that, quote, Ms. Langley argues that for it to have been worthwhile for Richard to kill the princes, he had to display their bodies, otherwise he did it for no reason, putting himself in jeopardy. And whilst this is a good point and does make sense, I can also see why some hold the opinion that she is often looking for evidence to fit her belief that Richard III was innocent of the murders. Plus, all of this talk of the new theories around the princes in the Tower has prompted some other historians to once again look deeper into the other side, the idea that Richard was guilty. In between the emergence of the two missing princes project theories, there was a counter-theory put forward by Tim Thornton, Professor of History at the University of Huddersfield. Back in 2024, he spoke about uncovering evidence that a one-of-a-kind chain belonging to Edward V, the oldest prince in the Tower, ended up in the will of Sir James Tyrrell's sister-in-law, as Tyrrell is still believed by many to have been the one who actually killed the princes. This obviously raises some major red flags. Professor Thornton and the other historians involved in the research acknowledged that there could be multiple neutral explanations for why the chain ended up in the sister-in-law's possession. And whilst they do accept that there are some good arguments in favour of Richard III's innocence, their discovery means that the balance is, quote, shifting towards his guilt. As I'm sure you can imagine, all of these different ideas being presented within the past 5 years or so have caused a couple of sensational headlines to pop up, suggesting that there's now this big row happening between historians sitting on either side of the fence. And whilst I don't think that they're quite standing on either side of a lecture theatre shouting at one another, I do think there is a real debate that's been reinvigorated by these new discoveries. And I am very much into it. I love that both sides appear to be prompting one another to dig deeper and see what they can find next. It's brilliant stuff. Personally, I find both angles to be quite compelling. I just want to hear more and more new details. And whilst my head says that there's probably a reasonable chance that the princes did sadly perish at the Tower of London, my heart hopes that the John Evans theory is actually true. I love the idea that Edward V lived out his days in Devon, leaving behind cryptic nods to his real identity in his local church. And I could only hope that his younger brother lived out a similar, quiet life somewhere too. One thing I do keep thinking about are the bones that were discovered at the Tower in 1647. After they were found, they were moved to Westminster Abbey and reburied in an urn. Aside from one instance in 1933 when they were forensically examined, the remains have never been looked at particularly closely. And I wonder whether modern DNA testing techniques could help to shed more light on the mystery. I did read that whilst the late Queen Elizabeth II didn't wish for the bones to be disturbed, King Charles is more keen on allowing it to happen. So could there possibly be some more definitive answers on the horizon? It's not often that you get to say these words when it comes to a cold case that's over 500 years old. But I think it's going to be a matter of watching this space. Well, what a story to kick off the new year with. Even if you're not a massive history buff, I really hope that you still found this story intriguing. I always think that a mystery is a mystery regardless of the time period it's from. And in some ways, the older the case is, the more thrilling it becomes when new evidence is brought to light. It's as though it's been lying there waiting for someone to find it or to join the dots and make a significant historical discovery. I would love to know which of the theories you find most believable. Do you think Richard III was guilty or innocent of killing the princes? If they did survive, where do you think they went? I can't tell you how much I enjoy reading your comments and hearing your thoughts on all of our stories. So as always, please do get in touch and share your take. I'll be giving my usual rundown of all of the ways you can get in touch right after our outro feature. So here we go. It's time now for Weird Media. I am so excited about this first Weird Media recommendation of the year because I can safely say that it was one of my absolute favourite, if not my actual number one favourite TV shows of last year. It was a late contender as it came out towards the very end of 2025, but I am talking about the incredible Pluribus. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I've mentioned before on the podcast that I'm a huge fan of the Breaking Bad universe, in particular the spin-off Better Call Saul, which of course starred Bob Odenkirk, but also featured the amazing Rhea Seehorn. So when I found out that the Breaking Bad creator Vince Gilligan was teaming up with Rhea once again for a brand new project called Pluribus, I was already massively intrigued, but it ended up being better than I could have ever imagined. Rhea plays a character named Carol, and without giving too much of the plot away, Carol finds herself in a completely bizarre, true nightmare of a situation. One evening, whilst she's out at a bar with her wife after returning from a book tour as she's an author, her life changes in an instant, when everyone around her appears to fall into this strange and disturbing trance apart from her. From there, we see this utterly mind-boggling situation play out. And it's one of those shows where you cannot look away from the screen for a single second. There is not a single moment for you to get bored, start checking your phone, none of it. I was captivated from the very first scene to the last, and I am already desperate to know what happens in season 2, whenever it may be coming our way. Rhea was already one of my very favourite actresses, but her performance in Pluribus is next level, and the look and feel of the show definitely has that Vince Gilligan signature style woven through it. So if you're a fan of his previous work, I think Pluribus would be right up your street. It's a complete edge of your seat gift of a show. You can watch it on Apple TV, and if you've already checked it out, I would love to know if you're right there with me, just counting down the days until we get a second series. Okay, let's take a moment to give shout outs to all of the sources I used in my research for this episode. First up, that fantastic article from The Telegraph, that was by Bill Gardner from December 2021. That equally great piece from The Independent, that was by Barney Davis from May 2025. We had 2 fab items from the BBC. One was an article by Julia Bryson from December 2024, and the other was a piece about the princes in the tower from the BBC History website. There was a great article on the historic UK website by Ben Johnson, published in March 2015. Of course, we had the Missing Princes Project website, which actually lives on the site revealingrichard3rd.com. There was lots of helpful information on there. There was a handy piece about Sir Thomas More on discoverbritain.com. That was by Sally Hales from July 2025. And finally, a lot of the historical information were facts I already knew. So in that spirit, I guess, a big shout out to my amazing A-level history teachers, who were all genuinely incredible, by the way, as well as my neighbour Becky for letting me know about this story in the first place. To finish off with, here's that quick reminder about all of the ways you can get in touch. On Instagram and Threads, just look up at Things Get Weird Podcast. On TikTok, we are at Things Are About to Get Weird. And on Facebook, you can find us by searching for the podcast name. That's where you'll find our main page and our private discussion group too. Our email address is thingsgetweirdpodcast@gmail.com. And if you've enjoyed this episode, I would hugely appreciate a quick rating or review wherever you're listening or indeed watching today. If you're over on YouTube, please do feel free to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe as well. Gosh, it feels really funny to be saying that again, but it's wonderful to be here. A massive thank you for joining me today, whichever platform you're tuning in on. I hope my voice hasn't been too distracting. I'm just so excited about this next chapter of Things Are About to Get Weird. It's fantastic to have you along for the ride. And I'll be back very soon with a brand new strange but true story to tell you. So until next time, take care of yourself and others and keep it weird. for the good kind of weird.